Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney, and I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our webinar, Teaching the Right Thing, Integrating Language and Content to Improve Outcomes for English Language Learners. I'm going to go through a few quick slides here as we prepare. As many of you know, you'll receive a certificate for CEU verification that will come to you directly from Zoom, our platform, within 24 hours. So just give it about 24 hours from when we close out this webinar, you'll receive that certificate. As well, COABE delivers 50+ webinars annually on many different topics. And these are brought to you thanks to our national level presenters who present typically at our national conference. And they're made possible, they're free to you as our members, made possible through our annual sponsorships. Right after this webinar, we will have the first in a series of 5 webinars called Managers Mondays. They'll be on the following topics: WIOA Basics, NRS, Basic Adult Education Structure and Activities, IET and Career Pathways, as well as leveraging WIOA Title II funding and other resources. So we hope that you'll join us for this next webinar. It's literally right after this one at 3 o'clock Eastern Standard. As well, everything you'll see on this webinar and future webinars is on the Adult Educators repository. There's thousands of educators on there that upload and download resources. So we encourage you, if you have a promising practice or something you'd like to share, we encourage you to get on there. There's also community of practice, so you can make comments and that sort of thing on others as well. As well, we have our National Board of Directors leadership opportunities. We have regions 2, 4, and 6, as well as our Vice President for membership. Not on this list is our President-elect position, which is also coming open. But the reason why that is that you need to be on the board and currently on the board and an elected member of the board as well in order to apply for that position. But the other positions are open, and information has gone out. So if you're interested in leading the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, I encourage you to look at your inbox and see if you might fit the criteria. As well, we have some really exciting national level awards: Teacher of the Year, Administrator of the Year, and Adult Learner of the Year, all $10,000 each, as well as the State Innovator, Workplace of the Year, and Advocate of the Year at $2,000 each. The winner, as well as the nominator, the successful nominator, also come to the conference for free. So that's another awesome benefit of winning this award. I did want to highlight, in terms of the Workplace of the Year, this really is our effort at supporting the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, which asks Title II and Title I to work closely together. So if you work well with an employer, we would ask that you would consider nominating that employer for this Workplace of the Year award. The Advocate of the Year really is, we've worked so hard as a field to bring in the additional funding. So as many of you know, we successfully added $60 million to the coffers and staved off $87 million in funding cuts, and that was through 86,000 plus contacts with legislators. So we're tracking that. We're tracking who's engaged in which state. So if that's you, if you've been someone who's taken action, I encourage you to have someone nominate you for this award, the Local Program Advocate Award. As well, we have an Adult Learner membership option, which we just opened up this past year. It's free now. It used to be free or $5, but we're offering it for free this first year. So if you're a program administrator or a teacher, we encourage you to get all your students on. It's a great way to amplify the voice of adult education with legislators. And there's a lot of really cool benefits for adult learners as well. We have our national conference coming up March 31st through April 3rd. We'll have an adult learner strand there at the conference. We'll have our ambassador training there at the conference as well. So, but besides that, there's 35+ strands there at our conference, as well as mini grants available. So if you're interested in attending the national conference, I encourage you to apply for a mini grant to offset the cost of registration. Last but not least, I wanted to mention our COABE journal. We've had over 11,000 downloads for our Career Pathways edition. Our next edition will focus on prison literacy, and it will be sponsored entirely by Essential Education. So this webinar is made possible with the support of Voxy. And today's webinar presenter is Katie Nielsen. She's the CEO of Voxy, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here for a second because I would like to read a short bio about Katie. So hold on just one moment, please. I read this. Okay. Dr. Nielsen oversees all curriculum development, learner engagement, and efficacy research at VOXI, where she leads a team of curriculum specialists, instructional designers, and research associates to curate language learning content, develop curricula, create test teams, design product features, and manage empirical studies. Prior to working at VOXI, she served as the PI on large-scale projects investigating the efficacy of technology-mediated language training at the University of Maryland Center for Advanced Study of Language. Dr. Nielsen was the academic director of foreign language at University of Maryland, University College, and assistant professor of language studies at Prince George's Community College. She has 20 years of experience teaching Spanish and ESL in the U.S. and abroad, and has designed and developed award-winning language courses. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Katie Nielsen. Katie?
Thank you so much for having me and for reading my bio.
Oh, you're so welcome.
I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see this.
Great, and while she's doing that, if you would just like to put your name and where you're from in the chat box, that'll get things going for us. So for all the participants, go ahead and just put your name and the state you're from.
Okay, great. And you guys should be able to see the screen now, right?
We sure can, yes.
Perfect. Okay. So this is an agenda of what I'm going to cover today. I'll do a little introduction to how language learning works and why it makes sense to integrate language instruction with content area instruction, and talk about how we can do that with technology. And then I'm going to end hopefully with time for questions, but if you have questions throughout, feel free to put them into the Q&A box, and if I can't get to them at the end, then I will follow up with you separately after this is over. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is that learning a language is learning a skill, which is different from studying a traditional content area. And that means two things when we're talking about adult basic education. It means that we should approach it differently. We should look at it like we're teaching people how to do something. But it also means that we can easily integrate language instruction when we're teaching people how to do other things. Whenever you get a bunch of academics together, they're very happy to spend hours and hours and hours fighting over the tiny minutia that make up their individual fields. And if that's the same thing is happening there with language learning and language teaching and second language acquisition. But if you filter out all the noise, what you find is that people tend to agree on 4 key things for second language learning to happen. You have to have access to input. You need to give people access to output. They need to be able to interact in the language, and they also need feedback. And so no matter what happens, if you build a language course using those core principles, then you're more likely to succeed. Because the science of how languages are learned has changed over time. So 400 years ago, we thought that grammar translation was how you needed to teach. And you would start at the beginning and you would go through all the rules and you would have people learn English or whatever language from translating things from their first language. And we know now that that doesn't make any sense. And that if you start at the beginning and you teach all the rules, you end up teaching people a lot of rules about how language works, but you don't give them the skills they need to use it to do anything. So working in a task-based framework where you start with what your learners need to be able to do in the language you're teaching and work backwards is much more efficient and effective. Because ultimately, people are learning a language because they want to be able to do something. They want to be able to help solve a problem, communicate their own problems, get a better job. And if we teach them the language they need to do those things, they'll be more engaged in the instruction, they'll make progress more quickly, and they'll be able to reach their goals faster. This has been demonstrated empirically over and over again in different workplace language learning settings. And so what's the best way to do that? It's funny, I came across a stat last week that says, as a whole, the United States is able to meet the needs of 4% of the adult English language learners here. And in order for that to change, we need to do something dramatically different. And one of the ways that we can extend our reach and scale our language learning programs is to use a blended approach, using software for what technology can do best, so people can do what humans do best. So now I'm going to talk to you about what we can do with technology. How can we teach the right thing in an adult basic English program using technology? The first thing that technology lets us do is individualize instruction. The most well-meaning teacher in the world can spend hours every night racking his or her brain trying to find articles that will be interesting to every single person in the classroom and come up with something that's maybe interesting to 2 or 3 people. But technology can let us give each learner the materials that he or she needs, and we can operationalize need in a number of different ways. Materials that are at the right proficiency level, materials that are on a topic relevant to the learner, materials that have to do with what the learner wants to be able to do at work. We can do all of that very easily using technology. And we can streamline reporting for better decisions. If we collect data on what all of the learners are doing in our classrooms, then we can decide what to teach them, we can break them into groups, we can know who's struggling, we can know who needs more help. Technology helps us resolve issues of space and time. This is especially important for working adults who can't always show up at a specific time and place for class, and who sometimes have all the best intentions but can't do things because of other responsibilities. We can use technology to resolve those issues. Technology also lets us offer rich scaffolded input. Now, what does this mean? I said one of the things that's most important for language learning to work is access to input. People need to listen to the language they're studying, they need to read the language they're studying. And it's best when the input is authentic. That means we use real world input. We're not scripting dialogues or writing out word lists that we think might be relevant to learners. We want to try to find examples of people using the language that they're studying. But that's sometimes too hard for language learners. Technology can let us make it easier. It can let us offer definitions or glosses for words. It can give us examples of the language in a simpler context. So we can use technology to make the real world language adult learners need more accessible to them. And we can give them access to tools. They can keep word lists with flashcards to practice words while they're waiting for the bus, and they can only practice the words they need the most help with. Technology also lets us offer real experiences. Again, one of the wonderful things you can do in a traditional face-to-face classroom is let people speak to each other. But you can use technology to let them practice using materials in English or whatever language you're teaching. They can listen to music in the target language, follow directions in the target language, read news in the target language. Anything you can do to bring a real experience in the language into the classroom is helpful to your learners, and that's easy to accomplish with technology. Because you can also integrate language learning with daily activities. People use all of these tools all the time for communication, for getting news, for communicating, and they can use those tools in the language they're learning in a workplace context, which will increase the speed with which they're learning their new language. So how do we do this? How do we integrate language and content? Here are 5 elements that will help improve learner outcomes and instructional efficiency. You can offer personalized courses that are based on learners' needs. So rather than starting with apple and banana and book and airplane, you can start your course with what your students want to be able to do in the real world. You can use 100% authentic and relevant instructional content. Again, rather than teaching language that is designed for instruction, teach with real things. If you're working on a workplace language learning program or an English program in the United States for learners who are trying to get jobs, have them bring in job listings, have them bring in materials that they need help with, and use those to teach the classes. Strategic virtual live instruction will help extend the reach of your language learning program. And automated assessment and reporting will help you make sure that it's working. Because the most important thing to do is to make sure you're teaching the right thing, and the only way to do that is to measure outcomes. So that's a little bit about what should happen. Now let's talk about how it happens. The first thing you should do to maximize the impact and efficiency of a workplace language program is to start with a needs analysis. Now this seems simple to people who work in business. Before you tackle a problem, you need to figure out what it is and what you're trying to do. But somehow for language learning, everyone seems to think that you just start at the beginning and you teach the verb to be, and you teach a list of simple vocabulary, and you teach people the difference between third person S and plural S. But really what we should be doing is trying to figure out who needs to learn English, why they're learning it, what materials do they need to read, what tasks do they need to complete. Because if you start out by figuring out what people need to be able to do, then you'll be able to measure whether or not it's worked. And you'll be able to use real world materials. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Instead of using scripted, outdated learning materials, teach English with the materials that learners need. This is a good place to point out the idea of learner agency as well. If you involve your language learners in the process, if they understand that they're going to be able to work with materials that will help them in their daily lives, they're more engaged and they're more likely to bring you real materials to help them with. People sometimes show up to a language class thinking that they're going to sit there and the teacher's going to give them the language. That they will, if they go to the 3 classes they need to go to every week, they'll be able to speak the language when they leave. It doesn't really work that way. I said before that learning a language is learning a skill, and like any skill, you have to learn it by doing it. If I wanted to teach everyone in the class how to ride a bike, I couldn't sit in the classroom with them giving them lectures about bike riding and expect that after 3 hours a week for 6 weeks, everybody would be able to ride a bike. What would happen is everybody would have some information about whatever lecture I had dreamed up about bike riding. We might talk about balance, we might talk about mechanics, we might talk about the benefits and disadvantages of starting with a balance bike versus starting with training wheels. But at the end of the day, all of those people would not actually be able to ride a bike if they hadn't been using a bike. And the same thing goes for English or any other language. If your learners are engaging with real materials that they need to be able to use, they will learn far faster than if they're using generic materials or if they're learning about how the language works. So, when you're building your language learning program and you want to try to extend the reach of it, there are some key questions you should ask at the beginning. And the first is, what level should my learners reach? Because if you're not assuming that language learning is a linear process that starts with level 1 and ends with level 7, that gives you a lot more flexibility about how to design your program. Not everyone needs to become perfectly fluent. Some people need to be able to read in English. Some need to be able to speak in English. Some need to be able to solve problems. Some just need to be able to understand directions that they're being given. Now, ultimately, to function and get promoted at work and survive in society and lead a rich and rewarding life, probably everybody should have some ability with all 4 skills. But when you're building your language learning program, it helps to figure out what skills each person needs so you can start there. You want to find out how much time your learners have, where they're going to learn, who's going to manage their learning, whether or not it's possible to offer them an incentive, and what your metrics for success are. These are 6 key questions that, if asked at the outset of a workplace language learning program, will help set you up for success. So now I'd like to talk about some examples of innovative English instruction that work in the frameworks we've just discussed. The first is when you can design a course that's aligned to employees' needs and jobs. So here I have some examples from some Voxy courses that we've prepared for other clients. But some of them, for example, are helping people take the US citizenship test, or giving people the language skills they need to be home health aides, work in the food service industry, work in construction. I took a snapshot of the English for the food and beverage industry because I wanted to be able to show you how specific the tasks get. Instead of a language course that you might see where you start with some grammar point and then you move on to a vocabulary list, this course is divided into things like dining management, serving food to go, handling questions and complaints, talking about food, dietary restrictions and allergies. We developed this course based on the needs of frontline employees in the food and beverage industry who need to be able to communicate in English so that they can have the skills they need to succeed as quickly as possible. To give you an example of what learners' needs are, I went back to some data that I collected about 10 years ago when I was working with an immigrants' rights organization in Maryland called Casa de Maryland. and they wanted help overhauling their English program because it was very one-size-fits-all, and they wanted to know what their learners actually needed to be able to do in English. They offered very low classes, very low cost classes in the evening for people from all over the state of Maryland who often came to those classes that were held in church basements, in community centers, and high schools in the evening after they'd worked all day. And so I sat down with a couple of colleagues and another professor at the University of Maryland, and we asked them, what do you need to be able to do in English? What we found was that they wanted to be able to read official letters in English. They wanted to be able to communicate with the police during a vehicle stop, talk to their employers. An overwhelming need was understanding a doctor's diagnosis, both for themselves and for their children. They wanted to be able to read and understand legal documents. They wanted to understand the instructions on medicines and vaccines. They wanted to learn how to get a driver's license, attend job interviews, talk to people from their banks, understand radio and television, ask for directions, and ask for information in stores about things they were going to be able to buy. Now, it probably goes without saying that none of the language learning materials that were available to those students at night had anything to do with any of these tasks. They were looking at reading train tables in European cities, identifying different fruits and vegetables at grocery stores, but they certainly weren't learning what it means to take something 3x day on the back of a bottle of amoxicillin. And so the information we collected during this research study was really compelling and important, and it underscores the importance of finding out what your students need to be able to do so that you can teach them what they need. Which goes back to some more key questions. When you want to evaluate whether or not the curriculum you're using makes sense, you can ask these questions. Is the language authentic? Do my learners have time to practice? Are they getting feedback on errors? Is the instruction personalized? What are the learning outcomes, and what are our metrics for success? I often get questions about personalization and how you can personalize instruction in a classroom. And I think it's also important to point out that sometimes having learners work in small groups while you circulate through the room and you give very dedicated attention to only 1 or 2 learners at a time is actually more effective than trying to lecture to an entire class of learners. One of the most important things for learning a skill, like a language, is getting time to practice. So when your students are in your class, letting them get practice with 1 or 2 other students while the teacher gives feedback is really important. We've talked a lot about how to set up a language learning program, and I've said a couple of times that measuring outcomes is critical. So let's talk about how that works. How do we measure outcomes? You want to start out with figuring out what to measure. This is a framework that gives you basically a 360 view into how successful your language learning program is. Because you look at the time on task, or the amount of time your students spend learning, which is the single biggest predictor of success. And then you want to look at the mastery of language and content. We're talking about teaching the right thing and making sure that you integrate language with content. And the way you can measure that is to look at learners' proficiency improvement over time, their performance on end-of-unit achievement tests, and ongoing instructor feedback. You also want to make sure that stakeholders give positive feedback, and you want to make sure that learners can accomplish their real-world tasks. That's possibly the most difficult to collect data on, but the most important. Every learner in an adult English program is there for a specific reason. And if you can measure whether or not those learners are able to go into the world and accomplish their goals in English, then you're truly documenting the success of your program. So here are some examples of data that I took from the Voxy platform, because these are the data to which I have access, but we could look at data from any number of places. This slide is compelling for a number of reasons. One of them is that it shows what engagement looks like in an online learning platform when students don't have any external support. So these were students who were studying on their own using Voxy, and after 3 months, 30% of them were engaged, which, when you compare it to other published data on what happens when learners are using self-study on their own, is incredibly compelling. It also shows the value of having institutional support for online learning. And I have a slide here that explains the importance of that. This was a group of learners who were using the platform. They were all Syrian refugees in Lebanon. They had access to Voxy, and they also had, they were coming from an adult education program, actually, where they had a champion on campus to help them use the platform and make sure their problems were solved. And you can see that they were using the platform, that over half of them were engaged by week 12 of the program. And they were using they were studying about 5 hours per learner per month. On average, they improved their proficiency level from an A1 to a B2, and their monthly active rate was 72%. These data don't tend to be available from any learning programs because people don't report outcomes data and they don't measure them. But being able to see how much time your students spend learning and what they are able to achieve will help you document the effectiveness and efficiency of your program, and will also help you see how you can improve it. When we talk about proficiency improvement over time, I took data from about 5,000 different learners who used my platform in different contexts. And you can see that on average, learners improve a level after 13 hours of instruction and 14 hours of instruction when we're talking about the very beginning levels of English. And then once we get to intermediate, it takes a bit longer. The average usage was 27 hours. These hour estimates seem very low. It's funny, I actually spent today going through as much research as I could find on how long it takes to learn a language. There's very little research on this. But we measure only the time that students spend in the platform using it, actively learning. And you can see that when students are engaged, working with materials that are relevant to their needs, they make progress very quickly. 80% of our learners pass their end of unit tests. This was an N of about 40,000 different Voxy students over the course of 2 years. And I have a slide here that talks about the impact of live instruction. I said early on that one of the ways that you can extend the reach of your program is by leveraging high quality in-person instruction. Here I'm talking about the average improvement of learners who don't do any live instruction and use the platform on their own. And then looking at learners who do work with an instructor, either one-on-one or in a small group setting. And you can see that even small strategic amounts of live instruction can elevate learners' proficiency improvement over time. I have some customer testimonials in here. I mentioned 360 satisfaction. I have some clients who've told us specifically how and why Voxy has helped improve their English learning in their workplaces. English training is key in global collaboration, and we chose Voxy because of the great combination of professionalism, advanced technology, and business services is one, for example. And then I also have learner testimonials. Learners have written in and told us specifically that things like, if my boss asked me about the English that I learned, I answered, how can I ask for a raise? Or it's easy to express myself when I talk about green panels and solar energy. I actually went through and tried to pull out good examples of learners telling us that this task-based approach based on their workplace needs was effective. Because I can promise you that there aren't very many English courses that are designed to give people the skills they need to talk about green panels and solar energy. Documentation of real-world success was the final piece in that course evaluation framework that I mentioned. And here I have examples of real learners who've sent me acceptance letters to graduate school, letters from their bosses, a report card, a wedding invitation someone was able to write to a long-lost cousin, a letter from a journal editor, and a WhatsApp screenshot. The point here is that learners in an adult basic English program have diverse needs, and we should try really hard to teach them the right thing. We need to understand how language learning works in order to set up a program that's effective. And when you use technology, it should add value and solve a real problem so that you can have your instruction based on learners' needs. In order to figure out how to do that, a needs analysis will help you define an overall strategy. You need to make sure that your technology can report outcomes, otherwise there's no point in having it. Fundamentally, everyone has to pay attention. You can't learn anything without paying attention, but you definitely can't learn a language without paying attention. And so you need to teach people the right thing so that it can help them and so they want to pay attention to it. Because moving away from a one-size-fits-all approach is going to be the key to establishing a workplace language learning program that's both efficient and effective. that covers what I have in terms of slides, but I hope we have time to answer some questions. And I have questions here, and I'm going to read them and answer them. Hang on 1 second, and I will stop sharing my screen. And I should just have my camera on now. Let's see if that worked. It did. So now questions. The first one is, as a teacher of literacy low beginning level students, figuring out what they really want to study, I find is nearly impossible. How do I figure this out with such low level students? Okay, this is a question I get all the time. And it's true that with very low level students, you sometimes need to give them options and give them a couple of things that they might want to be able to do and see if they can indicate which of them is more important. Also, when you conduct a needs analysis in general, asking people what do you want to learn in English doesn't make sense because it doesn't resonate. They tell you they want to learn to speak or they want to learn to talk, but asking them what they want to be able to do in English is usually a better question because people can start to think of things they want to be able to do. And then as their teacher, you can figure out which of those things make sense to turn into a lesson. The next one, how do you provide for students with very low level literacy in their native language? Again, there has been very little research on how to approach literacy and language skills at the same time. I think the bulk of the research indicates that you want to, rather than trying to teach someone to be literate in his or her first language, you should just start with the literacy in the second language at once. That being said, you need to focus on tasks that learners can do without literacy skills first, so they get some foundation in the language, and then you approach literacy for those learners the same way you do for any adult literacy class, giving them the basic building blocks. The next question is Voxy available on mobile devices? If so, do you have data comparing student success using mobile devices versus using computers? Yes, Voxy is available on mobile devices, and I have about 6 years of data on how learners use mobile devices and how they use the web application. Generally, mobile devices increase time on task. They give learners the ability to study anytime or anywhere, so we see better outcomes when learners use both mobile and web. But it's really learner dependent, and it depends on whether or not they have access to a computer, where they like to study. So much of language learning is personal, is based on individual differences, and learners, the best thing you can do is make sure learners can access your platform and your instruction in a way that makes the most sense for them. I give them pictorial tasks and they choose all the pictures. Yes, exactly. So starting with image-based tasks and starting with spoken tasks works better with lower level learners, and showing them pictures of things and having them identify what they're interested in also does. So I really liked the hospitality workforce lessons. Is it possible to allow us to peek at the Voxy content for those lessons? Yes, I can actually, after the webinar, pull together some screenshots of some of the hospitality and food and beverage lessons and send them out to the group along with the recording of the webinar. Okay, I'm gonna read this whole question out loud. You use intermittently learning and training English. To me, learning means conscious memorization, whereas training is related to subconscious training when the brain looks for patterns and forms, intuitive grammar when learners are doing English concurrently in class. What do you think about simultaneous repetition as an alternative to consecutive repetition? Okay, so I do use learning and training simultaneously. There are very, very different and nuanced definitions for both of them depending upon context. I think what makes the most sense for language learning in general is that learners be engaged in something that requires them to use the language to accomplish a goal outside of language learning. So when you think about repetition and training, it's better to have learners engaging in repetition because they're listening to a song they really like over and over again and trying to figure out the lyrics themselves than it is just doing rote memorization or rote training. I think that covers all of the questions that have been typed in so far. And I know that there is another webinar directly after this one. So I'm going to sign off unless anyone has anything else they want to know.
So Katie, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your participation. And I thank all the participants out there as well who engaged in this webinar. I hope you found it all really helpful. And this has been being recorded. It'll be archived on our website as also on our repository. So thank you. And I'm sure that everybody appreciated all that you shared today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you on the next webinar. Bye now.